is best understood as an art gallery and not a history museum. While this may be easy to understand while reading 4 Gospels, it can be difficult to apply when reading the portions of Scripture that record history. But a closer look at the books of Kings and Chronicles reveals that even the history of the Bible becomes richer when seen through the lens of an art gallery. 1st and 2nd Kings records 400 years of history for the nations of Israel and Judah. During that span, 1 queen and 40 kings sat on the throne of their respective nations. Of those 41 monarchs, only 7 kings walked in the ways of God, while the other 34 monarchs committed evil in the sight of the Lord. Between the 34 wicked monarchs, King Manasseh may have been the worst. Manasseh reigned during the 7th century BCE. He sacrificed children to the gods, he shed a plethora of innocent blood, and he undermined the religious reforms of his father. For 55 long years, Manasseh reigned over Judah as a tyrant until he finally died. 2 years after the death of Manasseh, Judah coronated his grandson, Josiah, as their new king. Unlike his grandfather, Josiah walked in the ways of God. Josiah outlawed religious child sacrifice in every form. He tore down monuments to pagan gods, and he integrated long-forgotten religious feasts and holidays back into the culture of Judah. In the historical record, the author of Kings proclaimed that Josiah was Judah's greatest king ever because he turned with all his heart, with all his soul, and with all his might to God in accordance with the law of Moses. As a reader, we assume that God smiled upon Josiah with pride for being wholeheartedly devoted to God. But the opposite is true. According to the text, God seethed with anger toward Josiah because of the sins of his grandfather Manasseh, which is strange because Manasseh has been dead for over 30 years. God's anger boiled over, and the Almighty vowed to bring destruction to the nation of Judah and to the city of Jerusalem because of the sins of Manasseh. 2 verses after that divine vow, Josiah rode into battle against Pharaoh Necho and the Egyptians, and Pharaoh Necho killed Josiah. Josiah's servants brought his body back to Jerusalem in a chariot and then buried him among the kings. Now, this story presents an uncomfortable picture of God. According to the text, Manasseh committed a lifetime of sins, and those sins provoked an insatiable wrath in God. After his death, Manasseh's grandson Josiah committed a lifetime of virtues, but the surfeit of virtues never overcame the surplus of sins. In God's eyes, Manasseh's sins were greater than Josiah's virtues. And in God's residual anger toward Manasseh, God, over 30 years later, enacted revenge on Josiah and allowed Josiah to die in battle at the hands of Necho. In this passage, God raged for generations, avoided forgiveness, and then inflicted retribution on an innocent person. While the historian asserts confidence about the actions of God toward Josiah, this certainty leads modern readers to question whether or not God is actually good. But this is not the end of Josiah's story. When a reader finishes the book of 2 Kings, the next book in Christian Bibles is 1 Chronicles. Continuing on in Scripture, the reader is immediately teleported back in time all the way to the very first human being. Chronicles then plods through an exhaustive genealogy that spits the reader out at the beginning of King David's reign, which took place about 400 years prior to the ending of 2 Kings. Reading on, we discover that Chronicles retells the entire 400-year history of Judah's monarchs that we just read about in the book of Kings. And while Kings and Chronicles strive to archive the same factual events, the recorded history between Kings and Chronicles is vastly different. In the book of 2 Chronicles, Manasseh still did evil in the sight of the Lord. However, in Chronicles, Manasseh, toward the end of his life, repented. Manasseh asked for forgiveness from God for the litany of sins he committed. and God heard Manasseh's cry and restored him as king. These amends are nowhere to be found in the book of 2 Kings. 2 generations later, Chronicles remembers Josiah as a righteous king who led the nation of Judah through a massive religious reform. However, unlike Kings, Chronicles does not record God harboring any anger toward Josiah because of the sins of his grandfather. This absence of God's wrath completely changes the history of Josiah's death. According to Chronicles, Josiah led the army of Judah out to meet Pharaoh Necho and the Egyptians in battle. Moments before the battle began, Necho sent messengers to Josiah. The messengers informed him that Josiah's God commissioned Pharaoh to march into battle against the Assyrians. And the messengers go on to say if Josiah decides to interfere with Necho's mission from God, then Josiah's God will be forced to kill Josiah in battle. After he heard these words from the Egyptians, Josiah ignored their warning. He charged into battle against the Pharaoh, and the Egyptian archers scored a hit on King Josiah. His servants gathered his body and traveled back to Jerusalem. Moments later, Josiah died. According to Kings, Josiah died because of his grandfather's sins. But according to Chronicles, Josiah died because he interfered with the work of God through Pharaoh Necho. Both of these books are in the Bible. Both of these books were written with the intent to log history. And both of these books offer contradicting records of King Josiah's death. How did the Bible end up with contradicting histories? And what can these contradicting histories teach us about the Bible? Here in the warehouse, 4 artists are drawing or painting 2 models. One model poses as a living king, while the other model poses as a slain king. The living king represents the life of Josiah, while the slain king symbolizes his death. To the right of these models, the first artist is positioned in a way that she can only see the living king. Let's imagine that this artist personifies the people of Judah who lived during the reign of Josiah. While Josiah is king, he is beloved by his own people, and no one suspects that his life will be cut short on a battlefield. So while the people go about their daily lives with Josiah on the throne, they are inspired and optimistic about what the future holds. This trust and optimism influences how the story of Josiah is told. Imagine a historian recording the history of Josiah, but this historian then finished the story of Josiah before his death in battle. In that story, the words would likely overflow with God's favor and happiness. In the same way, an artist who draws from the perspective that is blinded to the tragedy will portray Josiah as a confident and optimistic hero. Her unique place in the warehouse informs the art that she creates. If she moved to a location where she could see the model representing death, then her new location would influence the art that she created there, which is precisely where our second artist is positioned. This artist represents the people of Judah who loved Josiah, lived during his reign, and also wept at the shocking news of his death on a battlefield. If we asked these people to write the story of Josiah moments after his death, then we can imagine their account would be saturated in sorrow. The king's death triggered a theological crisis, causing people to shake their fists toward the sky as they wondered aloud, "Why, O God, did you withdraw your protection from Josiah in battle?" Here, in the immediate aftermath of Josiah's death, the people of Judah lived without answers. And that lack of clarity would impact the way they told the story of Josiah. As time passes, the people of Judah look back toward the death of Josiah and filled in the lines. This is represented by our third artist, who metaphorically embodies the author of 2 Kings. This author of 2 Kings wrote the story of Josiah about 80 years after Josiah's death. This gap influenced the history that the author recorded. From this perspective, the author of Kings addressed that same theological crisis that arose from Josiah's death on a battlefield. They asked the question, why did God allow Josiah to die? And from the comfort of 8 decades away, they answered, because God was still angry at Manasseh. This emotionally cold solution is concocted from an emotionally cold vantage point, because the author of Kings can only experience the life of Josiah through the lens of his death in battle. In the same way, the artist sitting from this distance cannot look at the living king without also seeing the slain king. This unwelcome presence shapes the art that she creates and roots her artistic expression in tragedy, even if she can offer a greater sense of clarity. The fourth artist paints from an even further distance than our previous artist. She is a metaphor for the author of Chronicles. While the author of Kings wrote about Josiah about 80 years after his death, the author of Chronicles wrote about Josiah approximately 280 years after he died. And in the 2 centuries between the composition of Kings and Chronicles, a massive amount of change occurred. During the era of Chronicles creation, people started to question the theological idea that God would punish children for the sins of their parents. In their minds, God could not be a God of justice for inflicting a penalty on innocent people. This contemporary theological idea nullified the story of God allowing Josiah to die for the sins of his grandfather. For this reason, the author of Chronicles, 280 years after the death of Josiah, changed history to match the contemporary theology of their day. This is why we have 2 contradicting history accounts in the Bible. In a similar fashion, our fourth artist is standing at the greatest distance from the 2 models. While this distance may obscure some of the details, this distance also provides a greater awareness of the model's place in a larger context. She can see more than just the models. From her perspective, the artist creates more space for understanding and reflection for what all of the life of Josiah has meant to people. Her work is the same work as the author of Chronicles, who changed history to tell the story of Josiah in a way that made sense for the theology of their era. The Bible is an accurate account of how a people group perceived and understood God throughout multiple generations. Sometimes, those perceptions of God changed, and other times those perceptions rang true throughout the ages. A couple of centuries after Chronicles was completed, the Jews who put the Hebrew Bible together actively chose to include both contradicting accounts of history in the canon. The deeper meaning of this contradiction enables us to see that our theology will change from generation to generation as we seek to understand the work and the character of God from our unique perspective in history. This consistent theological change is the tradition of the Bible.